caring for veterans in a specific way. I'm curious if you could just drop into the chat box where you're from, what your interest is in moral injury, and that can include maybe your profession. I'd be curious where everyone's from and what you do. And then Taylor, if you could read as people are typing, if you can see it.
Yeah.
So I'll go ahead and share my screen. BPA, general subject.
Yeah, so someone from BPA interested in the general subject and how it compares to PTSD, submarine veteran, but some in my family have had PTSD. We have another NAMI multnomah person on here, interested in building our programs to vets and military and want to learn as much as possible. Someone from Beaver Creek, Oregon, Executive Director of Veterans and Family Resource Center, a case manager for SSVF and work at ORCCA, Oregon Coast Community Action. Someone from Portland, Oregon, veterans who fought for U.S. entities but received no VA services, not allowed to if you weren't born in the U.S. We have someone who works at 211 Info, providing connections to social services, also retired Air Force, and whose son served in the Marines and did 3 combat tours. Someone who works at LifeWorks Northwest as a service director, as a psychologist. They have a particular interest in trauma and military veteran services. Someone who's interested in housing and homeless veterans, and someone is interested in Veterans Behavioral Health Liaison, or someone is a Veterans Behavioral Health Liaison for Oregon Health Authority, based in Portland, family member of veterans. A NAMI Homefront teacher, chair of the Veterans Mental Health Advocacy Council, Portland, VA, husband is a Cold War veteran, an Army member from Eugene, work doing veterans outreach for the Vet Center. And I'm kind of, there's so much typing, I'm getting kind of lost.
Yeah, no, it's okay, yeah.
I'm not listening names,
I'm reading
again, because we're recording.
You're good,
but...
yeah. No, I'm reading.
Oh, okay, cool.
Okay. Well, awesome. It sounds like a myriad of disciplines here, which I think is awesome to see. I think it's great that you're coming together. Yeah. Okay. So, there we go. So, like Taylor said, I am an Army chaplain veteran. I am currently a staff chaplain at the Boise VA. I just recently moved from the Portland VA where I was working. I specialize in mental health and moral injury and PTSD. And so moral injury is one of these topics where some may know about it, some don't. It crosses in between both mental health and spiritual care, pastoral care. All right. Well, I had this issue last time when I'm trying to advance the screen. It doesn't want to go. Why not? There we go. So the objectives of this presentation is to talk to you about trauma-informed care, which it may be kind of a no-brainer for you, but it's still good to cover it, to actually describe moral injury, to differentiate it from moral injury from PTSD, to talk about how they're different and how they overlap, to talk about some of the current treatments for moral injury, to address possible clergy approaches. It also could be community leader approaches to helping veterans with moral injury. And then we'll also talk about when to refer between both mental health, community resources, community clergy, because again, moral injury kind of has a proverbial toe in several different ponds of care. So trauma-informed care. Oh, and again, if anyone has any questions, drop it in the chat box, and then Taylor will kind of moderate the questions as we go along, because I prefer to ask the questions as they're relevant to the slide or the topic that we're talking about. And then we will go until about 7:50, 7:55, and then we'll take a break and then keep going from there. So we have about 2 hours set aside.
Anyone Pacific time, 6:50.
Correct. Sorry. Yeah, in Boise, I'm an hour ahead of you. Sorry. Yeah, right. You're like, what? Why is it a break at the end? Okay. So trauma-informed care is a program, organization, system, or an individual that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands the potential paths for recovery. You recognize the signs and symptoms of the trauma in the client, the family, staff, or whoever you're working with in a system. You respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into your policies, procedures, and practices, and you seek to actively resist re-traumatization.
Hey, Rachel, I'm sorry to cut you off, but the slides are a little fuzzy. Is it like that on your end or just for us?
No, on my end it's clear.
Okay, is everyone comfortable if I just send the slides out after as well? Otherwise, I could try sharing.
Do you want to try sharing it on your end?
Yeah, that would be fine, and you could just tell me when to.
Yeah, we'll see if it looks better. So as she's sharing, I'll continue on. So trauma-informed care, an example of this is when I'm leading a group. You know, I am not a mental health practitioner. I am not a therapist, psychologist, I'm not a social worker. Do I have some trauma-informed training? Absolutely. But in a group, I don't do any chaplain group that is led, especially within the VA, is not a trauma processing group specifically. If someone, and I will be very explicit about that in a group and say, you know what, this is not a trauma processing group. When you share, I invite you to share from using I language. You know, in my experience, I felt X, Y, and Z when this trauma happened. But don't explain, you know, I would ask that you not share the specifics of a traumatic event. We don't need to hear the gory details. We don't want you to share anything that is going to be activating for you as an individual or for anyone in the group. We want this to be a safe space because this is not a place for trauma processing that needs to be saved for your mental health provider. That is my boundary of care. That is how I navigate trauma-informed care, and also I do that on an individual basis. That for me, that boundary is set based on my qualifications. Your boundaries might look a little different, but within this idea of trauma-informed care, always being aware and understand what that person's trauma is, what may or may not activate them, and do you or do you not have the skills to hold space for when they are activated? Because there are trauma therapies that are going to specifically elicit some reactivation, or they do maybe write out the story of a traumatic event. That's different. That's very specific therapy in someone who's trained. So if you're trained in that, then you get this concept. But I really think it's important for us to have an awareness of where our personal and professional boundaries are when someone starts to share a story, because sometimes it might be the first time a person is sharing a traumatic story, and it will start to like flood out of them because it's this like cathartic pouring out of this pain, and they're maybe in a space where they really want to share it. So you need to be able to say, I value what you're saying, and in my word, I would say the sacredness of what you're sharing with me. And I don't want you to share more than what in this time frame we're able to unpack.
Good. I really like her. Oh.
Thank you. Be aware, you might need to mute yourself. And this goes into safety, especially with, with everyone, but you also need to have a keen awareness, is this person suicidal? Do they have, and that should really, part of trauma-informed care working with veterans, that should always be one of the first questions that you ask. Are you suicidal? Are you thinking of harming yourself? Are you thinking of harming somebody else? And also know that veterans are well trained in how to answer this question, because as veterans, every provider asks them this. As service members, we do training upon mindless training about suicide prevention, and it literally will go in one ear and out the other. And when you, as a provider, when you ask this question multiple times a day, every single day, it's like we can go into this automatic mode and we take out that personal human moment of what you're actually, you asking this person, are you so hopeless right now that you would rather be dead? And like pausing, and when you ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And ask like you care, because you're here because you do care. And so just be aware of how you ask those questions, because asking it in an empathetic and compassionate and caring way, and taking the time to actually look someone in the eye, trust that your brain has the skill to remember if they say yes or no, and you can write it down and take notes. But like, take the moment to look at that person and check in. And along with the trauma-informed care, because that's the safety piece. And having all of this awareness in your background is going to build trustworthiness and transparency between both you and that veteran or that group of veterans. Okay, next slide, please. And so the trauma-informed care, at the bottom there is SAMHSA. That is another great organization, and they have several resources if you want to do further reading about trauma-informed care. Okay, next slide. So with moral injury, I always love to talk about, all right, so what are our morals? So what are they? Personal, shared, familial, cultural, societal, and legal rules for social behavior? Are they the fundamental assumptions about how things should work and how one should behave in the world? Notice I'm emphasizing should work, should behave. Can be defined by family of origin, community of origin, religion, philosophy, community, culture, the military. So for veterans, their morals are wrapped up in all of this. For anyone, your morals are multi-layered or complex in how they form and where they come from. And some of them might seem intuitive when you think of personally about where your morals come from. So actually, if you have pen and paper, I'm going to have you take just, a couple of minutes, maybe, 60 seconds to a minute and a half, and just think for a minute about some of your main morals that guide your behavior, and think about where they come from, and just write that down for yourself. Because often I have found that you ask someone, what are your morals? Well, okay, I can say what the morals are. Where do they come from? How are they formed? Do your morals stay the same throughout life? Do the morals you had 20, 30 years ago, are they the same as now, or have they changed? This is a good place to start, a good practice for you to do for yourself first, so that you know what this process is like when you ask a veteran, what are your morals? Because in order for them to understand if those morals were violated, it helps for them to know what their morals are. If you can name the morals, you can name how they were violated. Easier. Next slide, please. Okay. What are the difference between ethics and morals? Ethics, the rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human actions, particular group, culture. It defines how things are according to rules. versus morals, which is principles or habits with respect to right or wrong conduct. It defines how things should work according to an individual's ideas and principles. So there's some language nuance in here, rules versus how things should be. One is more absolute, where the other might be slightly more flexible. Sources, ethics would come from a social system, military, external. Morals would be more individual and internal. And I would say with this, you could also swap them and they would overlap. Why do we do something? Why do we follow ethics? Because we're told to, because the military says it's right to do, because something external, someone external, system external says this is what you're going to follow. Versus morals, it's because we believe it's the right or wrong thing to do. Again, it's this difference between being absolute and external versus what you internally discern to be right or wrong. And if we don't follow it, we face peer, societal, military disapproval. In the case of like medical ethics, mental health ethics, you could lose your job, you could lose your licensing. Whereas morals, doing something against your own morals or principles, or if someone does something that violates your morals or principles, you feel uncomfortable, remorse, depressed, you have moral injury, moral tension, moral stress, but you might not lose your job. Are ethics flexible? Well, they are dependent on others for definition, dependent on outside sources for a definition. Whereas morals might be consistent. They may change, but in general, they might stay the same based on you as a person. And then the gray area, a person strictly following ethical principles may not have any morals at all. Likewise, one could violate ethical principles within a given system to maintain their moral integrity. Whereas a moral person, although perhaps bound to a higher covenant, may choose to follow a code of ethics as it would apply to a system to make it fit. So take a second, take a few seconds, and just think about, what do you think about are the difference between ethics and morals? It's kind of a big question to ask, but and if you think about it, someone's morals may be in alignment or in disalignment with what military ethics are. And vice versa. And they might be in complete alignment. You never know. It's individual to that person. But again,
I mean, I can see that, because
yeah,
you're a chaplain, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're a chaplain. Ethics, it's okay for me to kill on the battlefield. In fact, in my job, it was expected to, and I was okay with that, both ethically and morally. You as a chaplain might not have the same opinion. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes. Yeah. There might be the ethic of protecting country, protecting self, and in that context, the ethical boundary would say, yes, it is okay to kill, but your internal moral, when you look at it, might be like, well, the situation says it was okay, but my morals ultimately say that killing is wrong.
Right, and that's probably why you chose to be a chaplain and I chose to be an infantry officer, right? I mean, there's a difference there.
Yeah. What about others? What's your understanding of the difference between ethics and morals? You can either speak up, unmute yourself, or you can drop it in the box.
Would ethics be dictated externally, where morals would be dictated internally?
Yes. Okay, next slide. Yep. So what is moral injury? So there are about 17 working definitions out there about moral injury. These four are the four most common if you were to, you literally just Google what is moral injury. And then, so Litz, Drescher, Shea, and Nash are like the four top kind of, I don't say founders of moral. They really were the first scholars and professions that started defining moral injury. So it's perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. The disruption of an individual's confidence and expectations about one's own or others' motivation, capacity to behave in a just and ethical manner, brought about by bearing witness to perceived immoral acts, failure to stop such actions, or perpetration of immoral acts, in particular acts that are inhumane, cruel, depraved, violent, bringing about pain, suffering, or death of others. Moral injury is a betrayal of what's right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. It is stress resulting from witnessing or perpetrating acts or failures to act that transgress deeply held, communally shared moral beliefs and expectations. So basically, it's you were betrayed, you did something, or failed to do something that ultimately violates a moral or several morals that you have. Someone did something, you perpetrated, or someone perpetrated you. That violated, that action violated your morals. And where, next slide.
I have a question for you.
Yep.
So on that third bullet, if you can go back for a second.
Yeah, go back.
Yeah, it says the betrayal of what's right by someone who is legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. I'm not sure I agree with that. And I say why, because I don't know if you remember an incident about a decade ago of when the Air Force, because they had done so many, and I am not passing judgment on these kids, but you remember they were taking what I would call pretty either unethical or unmoral, and I'm not even sure which one, photos of doing stupid stuff with all the caskets coming off the C5s. Do you remember that photo? And the whole unit got into trouble because it went viral. Do you remember that?
I don't.
You know, and I'm not so sure they were probably having a what do they call that, gallows humor moment that got out of hand. And so it wasn't high stakes. They weren't at risk of anything, but it was really poor judgment on a lot of people. You know what I'm saying? So is that ethics or is that morality? Probably morality.
Well, are you talking about, do you think that the service members in that event felt like they violated their morals?
Not at the time. I don't think they did at the time because they were blowing off steam, I think. Again, that's that gallows humor kind of part of human. But after the fact, when the system came down on them, I'm assuming they kind of re-looked at themselves. You know, because the photos weren't very cool, right?
So this third bullet about someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation, it's, you know, when it's a high stakes or life or death situation, and someone in authority that you trust has your best interest or whatever best interest of the group is, and they violate that. So that might be from, you know, some people feel that from the overall government system or military system, or they feel it from a particular commander or an NCO. They feel that that person betrayed betrayed them. And in whatever way there was a betrayal, that betrayal violated a moral that they have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think there's a lot of gray area between the two.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like I said, there's 17 different definitions. Everyone has a different way of understanding this idea of something happened, either I did something or something happened to me, or I didn't do something and it violated a moral. There's a lot of nuanced ways to say that. So go to the next slide, and I'll show you. So these are just a handful of some of the different terms that are used interchangeably with moral injury. So a moral affront, moral distress. And I would say on the moral injury side, these are terms that more often will stay in the mental health side. And then the spiritual pastoral care side, they're sticking to soul loss, soul wound, soul injury, spiritual injury, and religious injury. And there are some nuanced concepts within that, but they're still ultimately talking about the same thing. Next slide. So the model of moral injury, I would say that you have the act, the transgressive act, the moral dilemma in the injury. Now, sometimes this might all happen in the same moment. The act happens, you notice the dilemma, you're immediately injured. Sometimes there's a transgressive act, and in the moment, the act doesn't violate the morals you have at the time. 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, now you're thinking about that event, and now you have a moral dilemma, and now you have the injury. So I always think about someone stabs you. They use a super sharp knife, and it's a clean cut. You might not feel the pain right away. You might feel it as they pull the knife out. You might not feel it at all. And the pain sets in later. Maybe you get an infection. Or you might get stabbed, and all of that happens at once, not the infection, but all of the injury, the act, the pain, the trauma, all at once. So in my experience and in how I have seen moral injury play out, this is going to be different for everyone. There are schools of thought that will want to pigeonhole this experience, like it must be the transgressive act, must be the dilemma, and the injury comes later. But for some people, it doesn't come in that order. It depends on the person, the event. What were their morals at the time? What was the injury? So just know that, like, within different disciplines, they're trying to stick, because it's easier if you have one model to be like, all right, it's A plus B plus C equals D. But human trauma isn't like that. Trauma, when it happens, is not prescribed like A, B, and C, and D. And different ways might make more sense to you. Again, in my experience, it's super individual. Any questions about that, or so far? Nope. Okay, next slide. So I won't go through these, but in case you're curious about religious examples of moral injury, I would encourage you to look at each of these stories. And I've actually done classes with my veterans using each one of these stories as a way of demonstrating that the idea of moral injury has been around for a very, very long time, just like PTSD. We didn't have, it wasn't called PTSD even before it was called shell shock. The military ethical take on creating, that is a good question, but very different PowerPoint. Yep. but just know that if you're meeting with a veteran and they are, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, or atheist agnostic, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey is a really good one to use as religious examples. Next slide. And so these are some different ways, images, that represent maybe some religious morals or religious ideas imbued within military life. And I use them to demonstrate that even when someone says that they're agnostic or atheist, somewhere in the narrative of their life or within the morals, it is useful to help them identify, or even within the military experience, if there is a pervasive narrative that influences their morals at the moment of trauma versus the morals that they have now.
So did God actually create the United States Marines?
Well, I'm going to say no. No, I don't. But I think there are people that do. And so it crosses that line of, when you go to war, this belief that we are, and much to my horror, I have heard chaplains preach this, that we are God's army, God protects us. We are going to do God's work. Now that is a religious belief, but could it also be someone's morals? What ethics are going to play or not play into that pervasive use of God language in the military? And this is coming from a chaplain. So I get it's complicated. Again, it's just another way of parsing out how deeply integrated certain narratives are. Moral narratives can be in someone's world, and they might not realize it. And they might be completely aware of it. But for you as a provider to have that awareness. Next slide.
Hey, Rachel. Question, someone edited their question. What is the military's ethical take on creating the battle mind?
Ethical take on creating the battle mind. That's a good question. Well, a battle mind, what do you understand a battle mind to be? Is it, I guess I would throw the question back. What is battle mind in your understanding? Because someone with my understanding, the way I would define it, is someone whose mind has been reshaped, reformed, and conditioned to function in a certain way that is conducive to battle. Because service members are tools, and I hate saying that, I have felt that way, but ultimately are, learning how to do a skill, having the right mind that is functional to perform a skill that adds value to a combat and or protective situation. So what are the ethics? I think there's probably a lot of ethics and a side conversation. But it would be good to keep that in mind when someone is struggling with, I was trained to have this battle mind. I don't have that battle mind anymore, or I didn't even agree with it at the time, and this is how I was helping them to understand if they were in conflict with that very idea of battle mind or how they were trained. Or if they were in complete agreement with it at the time, but they're not now. What is that journey for them to go from I agreed with it, and now I don't agree with it, and now I have moral injury because I did that. Yeah, there you go. So some military examples of how moral injury can happen. Acts of betrayal by peers, leaders, or yourself. Disproportionate violence inflicted on others. Either it is inflicted on a service member or the service member inflicts it on others. Death or harm to civilians. Violence within military ranks. Concealed acts of perceived cowardice. Failure to do duty. Exposure to body parts. Inability to prevent death or suffering, resulting in ethical dilemmas or moral conflicts. Now, this is not obviously a complete list. I mean, it's, again, trauma and moral injury and what happens is going to be contextual to the person. But these are just a few ideas. I'm sure we could sit here and come up with many, many more. Next slide. Some of the moral challenges of war: dehumanization of the enemy, killing, survivor's guilt, grief, encountering and handling human remains, participation in torture or atrocities, betrayal of authorities or by authorities, and doubt, uncertainty about the goals or mission. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just a handful of ways that someone's morals could be challenged in war or could be challenged in the military. There's a lot of non-combat situations where your morals are also challenged. Often when, it has been my experience when we talk about veterans, when I've heard the community talk about veterans, there's also often this like combat equals trauma, trauma equals combat, and that's the only place trauma happens is in combat. And while trauma does happen in combat, trauma also happens not in combat. And so that's, I think, helpful to keep in your awareness as you're talking to veterans, to not discount trauma that happens, or to be looking for trauma, not looking, but having an awareness that that trauma happens also not in combat. Next slide. So moral transgressions are going to be subjective to the person. Yep. So MST, someone just put in the comments, I have 2 female veterans that have trauma from rape. Yep. Military sexual trauma happens to both men and women, and often happens not in combat. That is a huge one, huge one. Let's see, based on veterans' own moral standards, expectations, and interpretation, rooted in familial, cultural, job-setting values, influenced by religious, spiritual, philosophical beliefs, kind of a reiteration of what we've already been talking about. And in the beginning, when I asked you what your morals are and where they come from, it's helpful to understand where your morals come from or what they are, so that when you're talking to someone and they start talking about their moral beliefs, that you're able to stay objective and hold space for what differences might be there in them sharing their story, and allow for that uniqueness. Next slide. So symptoms, kind of the nuts and bolts, moral injury symptoms. So you'll start with biological, physical, insomnia, startle reflex, alcohol abuse, drug addiction, loss of memory, self-sabotage, self-harm, and suicide. Psychological, anger, betrayal, which you can read through that list. I don't want to read through every single one. I think loss of self-worth, self-deprecation, and suicidal ideation are really big ones. Social and familial injury, social alienation, family disconnection, occupational dysfunction, distrust, And some of the spiritual injuries, anger and betrayal with a sense of anger and betrayal with God. I have shame and guilt and sorrow. That maybe they will feel haunted by what they've done. And a lot of these, when we get to the part where moral injury kind of overlaps PTSD, a lot of these someone will also have with PTS or PTSD. And this is one of the ways that the two, both moral injury and PTSD, overlap, is a lot of this are co-occurring. Next slide. So Brett Litz, psychologist, brilliant, kind of came up with this model of factors contributing to moral injury. So you can really kind of jump in at any point in this cycle. A loss of contact with what matters, which leads to self-destructive survival strategies that violate your moral code, which leads to self-loathing and regret, which leads to guilt, shame, maybe a sense of betrayal to yourself related to moral injury, and then you fail to live up to your own code, which then leads to unhelpful stories about why code was violated and what this means, which then leads into ruminating. You keep thinking about it and you keep worrying, and you just keep going through the cycle, going through the cycle, and going through the cycle. And so part of the healing is interrupting the cycle. And depending on the person and what modality you're using, you would interject at certain points. Any questions? All right, next slide. All right, here's where they overlap. So with PTSD, PTSD is an index, happens when there's an index trauma, an initial event that happens that is a life-threatening event. Okay, that's what they classify when someone's, when a provider is going through the assessments for PTSD. It is an index trauma that is life-threatening, which will cause fear, disgust, horror, helplessness. They're going to have avoidant behaviors. They're going to re-experience mood changes, physiological arousal, hypervigilance, because the brain in that moment, the severity of an event plus the severity of the person's internal response, both physiological, emotional, psychological, to that event, hardwires this neuropathic loop in the brain. You have the event, you have the experience. The more intense the two are and connected, the more intense those neural connections are made, which starts in this loop, right? Same with moral injury. You have an event that happens that your loop with moral injury, the loop might not start till years later. Whereas with PTSD, that loop is created instantly. And so when someone comes back and they have avoidance, or they have re-experiencing, they have nightmares, their brain and body are constantly in this physiological, neurological thought pattern and loop of reliving over and over, and the body relives that trauma over and over and over again. Whereas with moral injury, it's not as pervasive. Remember I said earlier, you may know the moral injury happens when it happened. You may feel that betrayal in the moment, that perpetration in the moment. Or you might not acknowledge it till 50 years later, 30, 40 years later, 2 years later even. Doesn't matter, time. And then your loop gets created because you start thinking about it. And you start having all the narratives and the physiological experiences. So this is kind of where the two, and you could have shame, guilt, anger, outrage. You could experience all of that while you're in the midst of having your PTSD physical experiences. You could have fear, disgust, horror, and helplessness when you think about the betrayal of your moral injury and the perpetration of your moral injury. But the biggest difference is, again, your moral injury could have also happened in a life-threatening situation, but the PTSD is the physiological response, whereas the moral injury is the moral and spiritual, ontological type side of the traumatic experience. Any questions or observations? Okay, next slide. And here's a more detailed breakdown of the difference between PTSD and moral injury. PTSD, again, exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, whereas moral injury is acts that violate deeply held moral values. They aren't necessarily life-threatening. With the individual's role at the time, they're the same: witness, victim, or direct exposure, or, well, with moral injury, failed to prevent. Intrusion symptoms, yes in both. Avoidance, yes in both. Cognition and mood, you're going to see persistent fear, horror, anger, guilt, or shame within PTSD, whereas moral injury, guilt, shame, anger, betrayal, perpetration. Arousal and reactivity with PTSD, yes. With moral injury, not as much. What necessity is lost with PTSD? It's going to be safety. Your actual physical safety, that sense is gone. With moral injury, sense of trust of yourself, of others, a loss of compassion, maybe that person will not feel forgivable, sense of loss of faith. And that could play into someone's sense of physical safety. If they don't feel like they can trust anybody, then they might not feel physically safe. But with PTSD, it's going to be mostly focused on physical safety.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
So on the exposure to threatened death, serious injury, etc., is that me, or could that be I see another person being threatened, or would that be moral injury?
It is normally what they would classify it as, well, it's exposure to actual or threatened death. So it could be to you, and if you're in that moment, yes, it is the exposure, but there's still going to be this element of your own sense of safety is also in question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You know, a lot of, and an example, like a lot of medics who go to collect body parts may not have necessarily been in the particular situation where the violence occurred, but they go in the aftermath, and now they have the PTSD, where their safety might not necessarily be in question at the moment, but they have PTSD just from the horror or the injury of what happened. You know, and they're going to have all of the physiological symptoms. You know, they can't, certain smells will be triggering, certain environments will be triggering.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think, Chaplain, that's why the vet centers opened up to graves registration folks, because they were always dealing with dead bodies. And even in the current war, the medical folks coming at the different stages back to the States. You know, does that make sense? So if you get hit in Iraq, you go to Bagram, then you usually were flown to Germany, and before you hit Walter Reed. I mean, so that trail is, at least on one part of the VA system, is recognized. So it's slowly changing.
Yeah. So we are at 6:55. If any. Is there to moral injury, PTSD, and survival? A lot of connection, that survival guilt could be from a life-threatening event. So someone has all of the PTSD that goes from that index trauma, and then the moral injury piece wrapped up in the survivor's guilt, and why they feel they should, why do they feel the guilt is still being alive? Yes, the two can be intrinsically connected in that example. So 6:56, let's take a 5-minute break.
So when veterans come home, and whether it's from combat or coming home, they are discharged from the military, they come in contact with their interpersonal, I mean, they're always in contact with their interpersonal morality, but there's can be a bit of downtime. But really they're removed from the conflict context, again, whether that is combat or just the military life itself. They're back into kind of the civilian world, normal world. They're not with their buddies or their unit anymore. They're not around a familiar environment, and an environment that kind of encapsulates and holds that current moral value and system and ethical system that they've been functioning at. They're around friends and family who often don't understand what their military experience was like, and the veteran often doesn't want to share a lot of what they went through because, again, they know they won't understand. Not that the family members don't want to, but it's just this matter of sometimes they are just really hesitant to share. Could be the nature of what happened to them. The veteran or the service member may no longer understand their own actions. They can often, with that sense of soul loss and kind of loss of their compass around their morality or question their moral values, they no longer know who they are or how to be, and they will feel disconnected from community. They will feel out of place in daily life because of that moral transgression. Very, very common for them to be in some sort of faith or religious crisis. And that crisis could be they draw closer to God or to their divine power and belief system, or in more cases than not, they pull away. They have a lot of anger, frustration, and confusion, and they've kind of lost their locus of where they are, where they're located in their faith. And they believe that they will be punished by the higher power for the actions or their lack of action. Now, on the next slide, we have addressing moral injury through exploring larger social and cultural and religious contexts. Now, in the middle here, we have facilitating healing through stabilization, processing, and reintegration. And this is really a 3-phase model of trauma. I did not come up with this. This is kind of, it is a very common model of trauma healing within both the mental health and pastoral care world. And around that, you have explore social narratives about war, violence, specific context of trauma. That is very important for you first to do within your community, so that you have an awareness as a leader about what that narrative is, and maybe what the theology is, and how the community holds space for trauma and responds to trauma, because that's absolutely going to inform how you respond to somebody with trauma, and specifically how you respond to service members and veterans who have trauma from the military. You're going to want to explore cultural narratives about war, violence in the context of trauma. So the culture could be, again, your community, and then the larger community or larger cultural context that you're functioning in, or that veteran is from. If you're working one-on-one with that veteran or that service member, getting them to dialogue, what culture and community did they come from, and what is that narrative about? You're going to want to explore with them their family of origin moral values and versus their current moral values. When I say family of origin, the family system that they grew up in, no matter how that family system was organized, it doesn't have to be the traditional mother, father, 2.5 kids kind of deal. Whatever their environment was like growing up, there is inevitably a certain set of moral values that they were taught. And have them, maybe do a chart or write it out, what were your moral values then? And then what are your values now? And you can break it up into stages, early childhood from what they can remember, young adulthood, maybe early 20s, or right before they went into the military, and then mark it by, okay, they joined the military, and now those moral values may shift. They're going to get inevitably influenced by the military, and help them kind of parse out what that looks like. And then you're going to want to invite them to talk about religious, spiritual, and philosophical views of the traumatic event. This is a space that is done well when both a pastoral care provider or clergy member can partner with a mental health provider and kind of co-create and co-treat. Because there's a lot of really, there's some good specific techniques and counseling techniques that a mental health provider would know how to do, and differently a religious spiritual care provider would know how to do, that can complement each other. But really addressing each of those areas to provide a more holistic view or approach to healing the moral injury. And on the next slide, we have assessments for moral injury. Now, these are assessments, questionnaires, areas of key focus that each of these assessments address. Now, you're welcome to look these up. A lot of these assessments you can find online. And they're really good tools to have in your toolbox to use when you're assessing whether or not someone has moral injury. And these are good, used by both pastoral care providers, leaders, and mental health providers. So I won't read through every topic, but please feel free to look these up and look over them. In the comprehensive resource guide that you got if you attended the webinar, there's a couple of these on there that are short forms that are also good tools to take a quick look at. So some of the mental health treatments currently for moral injury is you have the impact of killing in war. It is a 10-session individual therapy. You have adaptive disclosure. It's a 12-session individual treatment. It helps patients process moral injury through imaginary dialogue. Acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a commonly commonly used therapy model within pastoral care. Use present moment awareness, values, committed action, self as context, acceptance, and diffusion. And one of the reasons that this lends itself really well to being used by pastoral care providers and religious providers is it really is open to a lot of ritual. There are very specific practices within an ACT workbook, but there's also space, and I have seen it used in co-created rituals that have been developed by both chaplains and mental health providers that partner together and create really cool programs. And then trauma-informed guilt reduction therapy. It is a 6-session individual therapy that helps patients identify and evaluate beliefs, such as hindsight bias, etc. And those are all treatments that you can, again, you can find, you can read up on them if you don't already know about them. But if you wanted to pick one to focus on, I would focus on acceptance and commitment therapy or adaptive disclosure, especially if you are a pastoral care provider. And just a little more detail on the acceptance and commitment therapy for moral injury. These are the kind of the cycle and the phases that you will go through in an ACT program, just so you kind of get an idea, and feel free to pause right now and read through each one. And really in each phase, if you were to look at the workbook and look at the exercises within it, you can get creative and see where you could also work in some specific theologies or rituals. And ritual doesn't necessarily have to be religious in context. Ritual is a set of actions that has a set intention. That can be done in a non-religious way within a community, whether that is a coming home ceremony or a remembrance ceremony, whatever that might look like for you. Yeah, and so let's see. Moral injury healing is multidimensional. Yeah, it is really looking at the body, the mind, the community, and the spirituality. You to really heal in a whole way, in the whole person. It's mind, body, spirit, community. And so the body, sometimes the person needs to become physically safe. They need to have kind of their basic physical needs provided for so that they are in a healthy, safe space to do some of the deeper work that is required of moral injury, because it can be somewhat destabilizing. And I really want to emphasize that when you're working with someone who has moral injury, they're likely also, as we talked about earlier, going to have PTSD. It would be co-occurring, and you really want to make sure that person is stable. You don't want them to be actively using any substances. They need to be detoxed and have some base stabilized behavior, some healthy coping skills. And again, this is where it's good to really partner with a mental health provider, and for mental health providers to partner with clergy and community members that know about moral injury, so that you can help each other create kind of each of these areas. You know, one may know more than the other, but it really does take a community. It took a community to send that veteran and that service member into conflict, and if you really think about it, and so it is community that brings them back. That person, you know, sometimes that person joined voluntarily. If we're going to talk about Vietnam veterans, a lot of them did not join voluntarily, and so it is really important for healing that community be involved in holding that space and walking them home and fostering a community of healing and acceptance. Community support, I can't stress enough how important this is for both the service member veteran and the community members. A lot of healing happens both ways when the community and the veterans reach out to each other. I had this veteran a couple of years ago that had read this beautiful poem, this image of a bridge. You know, a veteran and a service member may reach out their hand to you as a bridge, or you may reach out your hand to them. And you might not fully understand, or maybe you may feel awkward, but just making the gesture, whether it's physical or metaphorical, or the invitation of creating a bridge between service member, veteran, and community member. A lot of protective factors when we stick together, and when we are together, you know, it can help show each other and show both sides that the world is benevolent and meaningful, and that survivors are worthy, that community members are worthy. And, you know, when you start creating groups within your communities to focus on moral injury, you create within that group your own mini community. And even if you are using the tools of moral injury to work with non-veteran groups and non-service member groups, specific clergy qualifications, they're specialists in guilt. I mean, they're really in guilt and shame, forgiveness, restoration, community, and ritual. And they hold space as the moral and ethical authority, and people imbue that authority on them. And so they're able to speak to people in a very unique way that person will accept. And they are representations of divine and representations of God and the power and will of God, and so are able to facilitate conversations and dialogue around morals and ethics and the spiritual religious nature of trauma. And for specifically for veterans and service members, there's going to be less stigma in talking to clergy than there would be a mental health provider, because within the military chaplains hold 100% confidentiality. As a chaplain, as military chaplains, we cannot repeat what is said to us. We cannot be called to testify in a trial. The level of confidentiality of the military chaplain is absolute, which is different than civilian clergy, minus Catholic priests, but civilian clergy do not hold that same level of confidentiality. They are going to be mandatory reporters, and a lot of veterans and service members don't know that, but they will feel more comfortable talking to a chaplain, whether it's in a hospital, VA, or a clergy member in the community. So often clergy members are a first line of contact. with them as they start working with trauma and moral injury. And just some qualities chaplains, clergy, and also community leaders hold and have is you can hold a non-judgmental space. You can be a non-anxious presence for that person, compassionate, empathetic, and you're able to meet them where they are in community and in space and in daily life, which can be much more comfortable and give them kind of an ease of access to care. And so some ideas for leaders to address moral injury. You could help people to be involved in the rhythms of the liturgical year, which can encourage renewal, and can also encourage them to go into the dark spaces of the trauma and to heal and grow into something new. You can have an inclusion of sacramental structure. And what I mean by sacramental structure is that if they need to pay penance or absolution, forgiveness, restitution, you can incorporate some of that into your community life or events or group. You could do dramatic reenactments and imagination of past sacred stories of redemption, or stories of redemption that exist within your community that have power and meaning to that person, that can be a source of inspiration and hope. Art therapy, practicing within art, painting, music, acting, dance, movement, getting that person in touch with the present moment of their body can be tremendously healing. And there are lots of people out there who specialize in art therapy and performance therapy. Equine facilitated learning. There are specific training programs and specialties for people that are both equine specialists and mental health providers, or equine specialists and clergy, or pastoral care providers. Super fascinating work. I worked as an equine facilitated learning pastoral care provider for 10 years on a ranch, and the work that horses can do is phenomenal. If you want to geek down the rabbit hole with me on equine facilitated learning, I would love to do it. It is powerful, powerful work. Outdoor recreational therapy, getting people outside, getting them kind of back to nature, can help them get back to themselves, can provide them space and healing. And a lot of veterans and service members are comfortable outside and prefer to be outside. You could provide community engagement around specific topics of trauma, suffering, war, conflict. You can hold community conversations or community panels, and again, create dialogue to engage people in the narrative and in practice of working with trauma and being present to trauma. Sending off and welcome home rituals. Sending off, if you have service members in your community, to hold ritual or events to send them off, and then to very specifically welcome them home and be present to their pain, and create some intentional events around them coming back and acknowledging some of those differences we talked about earlier of them being in one world of the military and now into the civilian world, and really marketing that transition. And then worship and ritual if you're within a religious or spiritual context. And then just for care ideas continued, motivational interviewing, which is a specific counseling technique, engaging theological meaning of suffering. You could normalize with empathetic and compassionate listening, understanding their beliefs and values. Again, creating ritual, prayer, community, grief support, space for confession. Confession does not need to be necessarily in a religious context. Sometimes, confession, when we think of confession, I think most of us would think about a Catholic priest, but that confession can happen in any space with someone that they trust. Someone that they trust is not going to judge them and really just be able to have the capacity to hold space for whatever they might share with you, because it honestly can be really painful to hear. And as an aside, you need to make sure you have your own really solid self-care in place, because when people start sharing some of the things that they've experienced, it can be intense, and you need to have a way to cope with it yourself. And educate your community. As you learn, teach others around you, because when you learn about moral injury for veterans and service members, that knowledge can be passed on to go beyond the military context and working with veterans, because moral injury happens in all areas of life in the civilian community, and it is definitely happening right now in the country on so many different levels during COVID. So really take these tools and think about how you can apply them also outside of a military context. This conversation obviously is within that specific context, but know that moral injury is not specific to the military. Moral injury happens to humans, all humans. And yeah, to really just start engaging and kind of plug in your ideas here at the bottom of this slide about what that might look like.
And then support groups, being able to start a support group in your community. And I will, if anyone wants ideas about what that could look like, or needs any consultation around starting a moral injury support group in your community, please contact me. Because really tailoring it to your specific community, specific context, and if you need to engage in any sort of specific theological perspectives, if it was a religious context, cultural, or social. But being in community in maybe a group setting can be a lot less threatening for some veterans, and for some veterans it's not. For some veterans, being in a community is terrifying. But either way, it's a point of connecting and them experiencing that they're not alone. Next slide. If you do want to lead a group, here are some topic ideas. Basic introduction to moral injury. What are some of the symptoms so they have an awareness of it? Maybe talk about the differences between PTSD and moral injury. You could teach meditation or mindfulness activities, diffusion activities. You could go into an ACT book and maybe look at some of the diffusion exercises. You could talk about what is reality, context of what happened. Not the specific event, but just what does it mean to have to put an event into context of who that person was in that moment. You can identify any spiritual, religious, or philosophical blocks or struggles that they're having. You could talk to them about the power of their words or their inner narratives. Talk to them if you know anything about neuroscience. Talk about those loops and how those loops, the more they happen, the stronger they get, the more the body experiences. And then how to create new loops, how to create new habits, new behaviors. You could explore shame, guilt, and forgiveness. And then you could talk about theodicy, which is the problem of evil. And that can kind of be applied in any religion. There's going to be a conversation about what evil is. Next slide. More topic ideas. What is spirituality? You could talk about helping them make connections. Is it connections back with themselves? Is it connections with community? Spiritual practices, do they have them? Do they not have them? Why or why not? What would be helpful? And this is where, like, again, mindfulness, meditation, prayer, ritual could go in. Or walks, it could be something as simple as walks, or fishing, or hunting, or biking. You could talk about hostility. You could talk about forgiveness, self-forgiveness, values, meaning-making, self-design ceremony. What I mean by that is, this is normally at the later stages of reintegration where they self-design their own ceremony. You help them figure out what is most meaningful for them if they need to do some sort of penance or absolution or forgiveness for themselves or for somebody else. But they actually design the ceremony. versus like a religiously prescribed specific ritual. And physical health. You know, if you don't know a lot about physical health, diet, and exercise, find someone out. There's a lot of nutritionists out there. Go find someone who can talk to that person about what is the connection between the brain and gut. You know, they could talk to them about simple ways of living and eating healthy. And then in my language, you know, eating is, you know, there's mindful eating, there's a lot of ritual around food and caring for your body. So, next slide. All right, this is we're not going to do groups or any one-on-ones, but question and answer time. What questions do you have? What observations do you have?
I want to real quick just mention some of our NAMI programs. We're going to have a presentation on Thursday, and all of our NAMI program leaders are going to be on there for our veteran-specific programs. So we have a veteran-specific peer-to-peer class, we have a veteran-only support group, and then we have Homefront, which is for families and loved ones of veterans. So if you guys want to join us on Thursday, I'd love to have you. If you want to, I'll just put my email in the chat box if any of you all don't have it yet. And just email me and I'll get you set up. But just so you know, a lot of the support that Rachel's talking about, NAMI does have a lot of options for that. So I just wanted to plug that real quick. I'll go ahead and stop the recording so that we can all kind of talk. I think maybe we're more interested in discussing that way. So